Sam Ellery had worked the night shift at WCOT, 91.3 FM, for 11 years, and in that time he had learned exactly one true thing about Cotter's Mill, Vermont: nothing happened here. Nothing had ever happened here. The town sat in a fold of the Green Mountains like a coin dropped into a couch cushion, forgotten but not lost, and the biggest news Sam ever read on air was a road closure for the Grange Hall pancake breakfast or a lost dog named Biscuit. He liked it that way. He had left Boston at 26 with a duffel bag and a bad year behind him, and Cotter's Mill had asked nothing of him except that he show up, play the record requests, and read the obituaries slow enough that people could write down the funeral times. He was 41 now. His voice had gone a little rougher, a little more like gravel under snow, and old Mrs. Abaird's at the diner said it was the best voice in 3 counties, better than the radio men in Burlington, and Sam believed her because it was pleasant to believe. It was the 3rd week of October when he first noticed the chair. He was at Dot's diner, same booth he always took, second from the window, and he was 3 bites into his patty melt when he realized the stool at the counter, the one on the end, closest to the pie case, the one that had a name, was gone. Not empty. Gone. There was a stretch of clean floor tile where a stool should have been, for small circles worn pale into the linoleum where its feet had stood for probably 40 years, and no stool. "Dot," he said, "where's Earl's stool?" Dot Pruitt was refilling ketchup bottles behind the counter, her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair, and she looked at him with the particular blankness of someone who has been asked what color the sky is. "Whose stool?" "Earl's. The end stool. He sits there every morning, orders his eggs over medium, complains about the socks." Sam heard his own voice starting to climb, the way it did sometimes right before a live mic went hot and his throat tightened up on him. "He was here yesterday, Dot. You gave him grief about his cholesterol." Dot looked at the empty stretch of floor. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough that Sam felt the hair go up on his arms, and then she looked back at him and smiled the smile she gave to out-of-towners who ordered their coffee wrong. "Honey, I think you're thinking of somewhere else. We've never had a stool there. Counters always ended at the register." And here was the thing that Sam would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward, the thing that made his stomach drop the way it does when a car goes over a rise too fast. She wasn't lying. He had interviewed enough town selectmen and cornered enough teenagers who'd egged the water tower to know what a lie looked like on a face, the little flicker before the mouth moves. Dot didn't have that flicker. Dot believed, completely and calmly, that the counter had always ended at the register. Sam looked down at his plate. The 4 pale circles on the tile were still there, plain as a scar. He told himself it was nothing, the way you tell yourself a lot of things at 2 in the morning when you're alone in a radio booth with only a red on-air light and the hum of the transmitter for company. He played a Fleetwood Mac record and read the weather: clear, cold, first frost expected, and between songs he found himself thinking about Earl's stool, and about Earl's face, and realizing with a small cold lurch that he could not, actually, picture Earl's face. He could picture the shape of a man sitting there. Flannel. A sock's cap. But when he reached for the face itself, the way you'd reach for a light switch in a familiar room, his hand closed on nothing. That was the night the pattern started for him, though he wouldn't have called it a pattern yet. He would have called it a bad feeling, the kind you get from too much coffee and too little sleep, the kind a sensible man drives home from at 4 a.m. and sleeps off. He did not sleep it off. 3 days later he asked his producer, a 24-year-old named Priya who ran the board on weekends and thought Sam was hopelessly ancient in a way she found endearing, whether she remembered a regular named Earl at Dot's. "Earl who?" "Just Earl. Older guy. Sits at the counter." Priya thought about it with the genuine effort of someone trying to be helpful, not the polite blankness that had shown. I don't think so. I mean, I don't really go to Dots on weekday mornings. Why, is there a story? There was, Sam was beginning to think, though not the kind he could put on 91.3 FM between the school lunch menu and the church bulletin. He started keeping a notebook. He felt foolish doing it, the way he'd felt foolish in his 20s writing down his dreams, but he did it anyway, because the alternative was to let the cold feeling in his chest go unspoken, and Sam had learned a long time ago that unspoken things grow teeth. Asterisk girl. Counter stool at Dots. Gone, no one remembers. Even the floor remembers, marks, but no people do, asterisk. He looked at that sentence for a long time before he closed the notebook. October in Cotter's Mill was, by ancient and unbothered tradition, the month of the Founder's Bell. It hung in the cupola of the old mill building down by the river, the mill the town was named for, though the mill itself had stopped grinding grain sometime around Eisenhower and now housed an antique co-op and, in the basement, the Historical Society's collection of dusty ledgers nobody read. Once a year, on the last Saturday of October, the volunteer fire department rang the bell to mark the town's founding in 1791, and there was a chilly supper, and kids in costumes ran around the green, and it was, Sam had always thought, about as spooky as a Norman Rockwell painting. He'd done the remote broadcast from the Founders Bell Festival every year for a decade. This year, 3 days before it, he went down to the Historical Society to pull some quotes for his broadcast, quaint founding facts, the kind of thing that made good radio filler, and found Constance Whitfield, the volunteer archivist, sitting very still at her desk with a ledger open in front of her and an expression on her face that Sam did not like at all. Constance was 70-some, sharp as a tack, the kind of woman who corrected your grammar and your history in the same breath. She did not, as a rule, sit still. Connie. She looked up at him slowly, and there was something in her eyes that made Sam think, absurdly, of a woman standing at the edge of a pool trying to decide if the water was cold. Sam. Good. Come look at this. He came around the desk. The ledger was old, real old, leather gone soft and dark with handling, pages the color of weak tea. It was a record book, columns of names in a cramped, careful hand, dated from the town's earliest years. This is the founding roll, Constance said. Every household that settled Cotter's Mill in 1791. I've read this book probably 200 times, Sam, I could recite you the names in my sleep. Whitfield, obviously. Cotter. Pruitt. Auberts. Ellery. My family's in there. Your people have been here since the beginning, same as most of us. She said it distractedly, still looking at the page. That's not what I called you over for. Look here. She turned the book toward him and tapped a column. This lists 31 households. 31. I know that number, Sam, I've known it since I was younger than you. It's on the plaque outside. 31 families, 31 founding hearths, that's what the bell rings for, one toll for each. Okay. Count them. Sam counted them. He counted them twice, because the first time he got 30 and assumed he'd made an error. 30, he said. 30, Constance agreed, and her voice had gone very quiet. I count 30 every time now. I used to count 31. I know I used to, because I wrote a paper on it in 1988, and I have the paper right here. She pulled a yellowed folder from a drawer, hands not quite steady, and in my own paper, in my own handwriting, it says 31. But the book says 30. It has always, apparently, said 30. There is no 31st name. There is no gap where a 31st name should be. The ink is uniform, the spacing is uniform, there is no 31st household and never was. Sam felt the diner floor tile again, 4 pale circles where a stool used to be. Connie. What was the name? In your paper. The 31st family. Constance Whitfield looked at him, and for the first time in the 11 years Sam had known her, she looked frightened. I don't know, she said. I wrote it down. I can see where I wrote it. And I cannot read my own handwriting, Sam. It's not smudged. It's not faded. I simply cannot make my eyes understand what the letters say. It's like trying to read in a dream. Part 2. Sam did not sleep that night, or the one after. He sat in his kitchen with Constance's folder and a legal pad and tried to make himself useful the only way he knew how, which was to ask questions and write down the answers, because that was what 20 years of radio had trained into him, and because doing something felt marginally better than doing nothing while the edges of the world quietly redrew themselves. He called his mother, who still lived 2 towns over in Barrow, and asked her, carefully, if she remembered a family named, and here he realized he had no name to offer, and felt something close to panic, a family that wasn't the Ellerys, or the Pruitts, or the Whitfields, or any of the names he could think of, a family that maybe used to live near the mill. What's this about, Sammy? His mother's voice, thinned by age and the phone line, sounded far away in more ways than one. I don't know yet. Do you remember one? A long pause. There's always been talk, she said finally, about a family that didn't stay. Old talk, older than me, older than your grandmother probably. I don't think I ever heard a name. Just that they left, or died out, or something, early on, and the town sort of closed over the space where they'd been. Like water. You know how a pond looks like nothing ever fell in, 2 minutes after you throw a rock. She laughed, a little uneasily. Where'd you dig that up? You writing something for the paper? Something like that, Sam said, and thanked her, and hung up, and sat looking at the phone for a long time. The town closed over the space where they'd been, his mother's phrase stuck in him like a fishhook. He went back to the Historical Society the next morning, and this time he and Constance worked together, methodically, the way you'd work a jigsaw puzzle missing its box lid. They pulled deeds. They pulled the church register, which went back to 1793 and recorded baptisms, marriages, burials, in a hand so faded in places it took a magnifying glass. They pulled the mill's own account books, because in 1791 a grain mill was the beating economic heart of a settlement and every household would have had an account. The deeds showed 30 parcels of original land. The church register showed 30 founding families receiving the sacraments. The mill books showed 30 accounts opened in the settlement's first year. But 3 separate times, in 3 separate documents from 3 separate decades, Sam and Constance found the same small, telling flaw, a number that didn't match its own list. The 1791 town charter, in its opening paragraph, declared itself established, by the 31 households whose names are hereto subscribed, and then subscribed 30. A 1840 survey map noted 31 original mill shares, of which 30 presently held. A obituary from 1902, for a woman named Prudence Cotter, described her as, among the last living descendants of the 31 founding lines, and then, in the very next sentence, discussed, the 30 families who built our church. It's not a mistake, Constance said, very quietly, in the low gold light of the archive room, dust turning slow in the air between them. A mistake happens once. This is a scar. Something got cut out, Sam, and cut out clean, and the wound keeps almost healing shut over the stitches, but every so often, if you look close, you can see where the thread used to be. Cut out by what? Constance closed the ledger very gently, the way you'd close the eyes of someone who had just died. I don't know. But I know when it happens. I've been in this building 40 years, and I've never thought to notice, because why would you notice a thing that's designed so you don't, but I'm noticing now. It's always around the Founder's Bell. Always the last week of October. She looked up at him, and behind her glasses her eyes were wet. Sam. When's the last time you actually heard the bell ring? Not the fire department getting ready. Not the tuning. The actual bell, at the actual festival, the actual toll. Sam opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own creeping horror, that he could not remember. He had done the remote broadcast every year for a decade. He could picture the chilly supper. He could picture the kids in costumes. He could not, no matter how he reached for it, remember the sound of the bell. He drove to the mill that afternoon, alone, telling Priya he was scouting the site for Saturday's remote, which was true enough as far as it went. The old building sat heavy and brick-red above the river, the water running low and black under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and Sam stood at the base of the cupola and looked up at the bell for a long time. It was a plain bell, unremarkable, greenish with age, hung on a wooden yoke that had been replaced sometime in living memory. The wood was newer than the bell, newer than the building even, pale where it should have weathered dark. Someone had rebuilt the housing. Recently, relatively speaking. Within the last 50 years, maybe less. There was a plaque at the base of the tower stairs, brass, green-spotted. Founder's Bell, it read. Cast 1791. Rung each autumn in memory of the 31. Sam read it 3 times. The 31, not 30. The plaque knew what the ledgers had forgotten, or half forgotten, the way you half remember a dream at breakfast and lose the rest of it by lunch. He climbed the tower stairs. They were narrow and close, and his own breathing sounded very loud in the enclosed dark, and when he came out into the little wooden cupola at the top, the bell hanging silent and green above him, he found something that made him stop with one hand still on the stair rail. Scratched into the underside of the wooden yoke, small, careful, clearly done with a knife or a nail by someone who did not want to be seen doing it, was a single word. Remember. And beneath it, smaller, half worn away by 50 years of weather blowing through the open louvers of the cupola, in a different hand, cruder, more desperate. They take the name and the name takes the person. Sam stood in the cold tower with the dead bell above him and the brown river below him, and for the first time since the business with Earl's Stool, he was not confused. He was afraid. Part 3. He didn't tell Priya. He didn't tell his mother. He told Constance Whitfield, because Constance was the only other person in Cotter's mill who seemed to still be standing on solid ground while the rest of the town's memory eroded quietly around them like a riverbank nobody was watching. They met at her kitchen table that night, the Historical Society's ledgers spread between them like evidence at a trial, and Sam told her about the cupola, about the 2 messages scratched into the yoke, and watched her face go the color of the pages in front of her. Asterisk they take the name and the name takes the person, asterisk, Constance repeated. That's not a metaphor, is it? You don't think that's a metaphor? I don't know what I think. Sam rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days and the world had gotten a thin, brittle quality to it, like ice on a puddle that would crack if he put his weight down wrong. I think Earl was real. I think Earl sat on that stool for probably 30 years and I think something happened to him around the last week of October and I think whatever it is, it didn't just take Earl. It took the fact of Earl. It went back and unwrote him, a little, like an eraser dragged backward through everyone's memory, except it can't quite get it all, there's always some mark left. A worn spot on the floor. A number that doesn't add up. A word scratched into wood by somebody who knew what was coming and wanted the next person to know too. Constance was quiet for a while. Outside, wind moved through the maples in her yard, stripping the last of the red leaves, and somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and stopped. "There's a legend," she said finally, slowly, like she was afraid of the words even as she reached for them. "I heard it from my grandmother when I was small, and I always took it for a ghost story, the kind you tell to make children behave near the river. She said the mill wasn't built on empty land. She said the 31 families made a bargain with, she never said what. Something that was here before them. Land don't come free, my grandmother used to say, not land like that, not with a river that never froze even in the worst winters and soil that grew wheat like it was showing off. She said the bargain was that every generation, the town would give something back. A name. A person. Given over, quiet, unremembered, so the giving itself wouldn't leave a mark on anybody's conscience, because how do you mourn what you can't recall ever having? That's insane, Sam said, and heard how unconvincing he sounded even to himself. It is, Constance agreed. It's also, apparently, sitting in a ledger on my desk with one name permanently missing from a book that's been recopied, transcribed, and photographed 100 times over 200 years, and never once caught the error, because the error isn't in the book. The error is in us, in what we're able to notice. She reached across the table and gripped his wrist, and her hand was cold and strong. Sam. When did you say the bell gets rung? Saturday. Founders Bell Festival. Day after tomorrow. And who rings it? Sam felt the cold spread up from his stomach into his chest, because he already knew the answer before he made himself say it out loud, the way you already know the punchline of a joke that's about to hurt. I do, he said. I've done the remote broadcast every year for a decade. Last 4 years, the fire chiefs asked me to pull the rope myself, on air, for the color of it. Local voice, local bell. It's part of the bit. Every year. Constance's grip on his wrist tightened. Sam. I want you to think, very carefully, and tell me, in all those years, on air, on the recordings, in your own memory, have you ever once actually heard that bell ring? Not the anticipation of it. Not the crowd cheering. The bell itself. Sam sat in the warm kitchen with the cold pressing against the windows and understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching a wave draw back from the shore just before it comes in, that he could not remember. Not once. 10 years of pulling that rope, 10 years of the crowd on the green looking up expectant and pleased, and in his memory the moment simply skipped. Like a scratch on a record. Like a held breath that never let go. They did not sleep. They spent the rest of that night going back through the church register with fresh eyes, looking not for names but for gaps, for the shape of an absence, and they found it, finally, close to 3 in the morning, in the burial records for 1792, the year after the founding. There was an entry, badly faded, for a burial with no name recorded, only a description, in the careful copperplate hand of the town's first minister, buried this day the stranger who came to us in the founding year and gave freely of himself that the mill might turn and the wheat might grow, in accordance with the compact made. May God have more mercy on him than we were able to show, *. No name. Just the stranger. Somebody gave first, Constance whispered. Somebody outside the 31 families. A stranger, come to town, offered up first to sweeten the deal, maybe, or tricked into it, we'll never know. And it worked. And once it worked once. They kept doing it, Sam finished. Every year. Some years maybe they skip, maybe the compact only needs feeding every so often, I don't know how it works, but it needs an offering, and the town forgets each one almost as soon as they're gone, because that's the whole design of it, a sacrifice nobody has to grieve, because nobody's allowed to remember there was anything to grieve. And you, Constance said, very softly, ring the bell. Sam looked at his own hands on her kitchen table, hands that had pulled a bell rope 10 Octobers running while a crowd cheered and a radio audience listened and something, somewhere, took its due, and no one, not one soul in Cotter's Mill, had ever once heard the sound the bell actually made, because the sound wasn't for them. It never had been. I think, he said slowly, that ringing that bell is how it's fed. I think that's what the rope does. I think it's not calling the town to the green. I think it's calling something else, and the crowd, and the chilly supper, and the costumes, I think that's just the wrapping paper. I think somebody, a long time ago, figured out that if you make the horror look enough like a party, nobody thinks to be afraid of it. ## Part 4. Friday, the day before the festival, Sam went looking for the name. Not Earl's, he had given up, with a grief that surprised him in its rawness, on ever fully recovering Earl's face, though he found that if he closed his eyes and thought hard about flannel and a socks cap and the particular gravel of an old man's complaint about bullpen management, something like a shape would surface, blurred at the edges, the way a photograph left in the sun goes soft and pale. That was the best he was going to get, he understood now. That was what being taken by this thing looked like from the outside, not death, exactly, not that a stranger could point to. Just a slow, gentle sanding down of the fact that you had ever been sharp-edged and specific and real. No, the name he wanted now was the 31st Families. If there was a name, however faded, however unreadable, maybe there was a way to give it back. Constance's theory, offered hesitantly over her fourth cup of coffee as the sky outside went from black to the gray of an old bruise, was this: the compact runs on forgetting. If forgetting was the mechanism, maybe, remembering was the wrench in it. You couldn't fight a hunger. But maybe you could starve it, if what it fed on was being unknown, and you simply refused to let something stay unknown. It was thin. It was, Sam thought, probably going to get him laughed out of his own town, assuming he lived to be laughed at. But it was the only door he could see in a room that otherwise had none. He went back to the mill in the gray hour before the town woke, climbed the tower stairs one more time, and this time he brought a flashlight and a soft brush he'd taken from Constance's archival kit, and he knelt on the cold cupola floor and worked, patiently, at the wood around that second scratched message. They take the name and the name takes the person, because if somebody 50 years ago had cared enough to carve a warning, Sam was willing to bet they'd cared enough to sign it. Somewhere close, in some smaller and more hidden way. He found it after 20 minutes, low on the yoke support post, nearly swallowed by a knot in the wood, 3 letters, deep cut, deliberate. T.H.C. Initials. Not a name. But a thread. He drove straight to Constance's, initials burning a hole in his thoughts, and together they went back through 50 years of town records looking for anyone whose name might fit, and it was Constance, sharp as ever even on no sleep, who found it inside an hour, in a 1974 edition of the Cotter's Mill Weekly Beacon, on a yellowed page of local notices, a boy named Thomas Henry Cotter, 17 years old, reported missing after the Founders' Bell Festival of that year, presumed to have run off, the article speculated, as boys of that age sometimes will. No follow-up article existed. No further mention of Thomas Henry Cotter appeared anywhere in the paper's subsequent 40 years of archives, not even, Constance found with a small strangled sound, in the Cotter family's own listed genealogy in the Historical Society's files, where the family tree simply skipped, with the smooth and unremarked confidence of a bridge built over a filled ravine, from a father and mother directly to a younger daughter, as though the space for an older son had never been drawn at all. He knew, Sam said quietly, looking at the boy's name in 50-year-old newsprint. Somehow, before it happened to him, he knew what the bell really did. He climbed up there and he left a warning for whoever came after him. And then they took him anyway. And the town forgot him within a generation, Constance said. His own family's genealogy forgot him. That's, Sam, that's the cruelty of it, isn't it? It's not just that it takes you. It's that it takes the proof that taking you cost anything. Sam thought of Earl's stool. For pale circles on clean linoleum, the only witness left to 30 years of a man's mornings, and even that would fade eventually, he supposed, the next time Duck got new flooring put in, and then there would be nothing physical left in the whole world to say Earl had ever sat there at all. He felt something harden in him then, something that had been loose and frightened and reactive since the moment he'd noticed the empty stool, settle instead into a kind of cold, clean anger, the particular anger of a man who has spent 11 years reading obituaries slowly enough for a grieving town to write down the details, and who has just understood that somewhere close by, something has been quietly ensuring there would be no obituary to read at all. Tomorrow, he said, they're going to hand me that rope again. Part 5. Saturday came in cold and very clear, the sky scoured blue, frost silvering the green in front of the old mill, and by 10 in the morning half of Cotter's mill was there in coats and costumes, kids running between the folding tables with cups of cider, the volunteer fire department setting up the chili competition, the whole bright ordinary business of a small town enjoying itself completely unaware of what it was standing on. Sam did his remote broadcast from a folding table near the mill steps, the same as every year, cracking the same warm jokes about the socks and the weather, and if his voice shook slightly under the good cheer, nobody who didn't know him the way Priya did seemed to notice. Priya noticed. She caught him behind the equipment van around noon, her dark eyes narrow with the particular worry of someone young enough to still trust their own instincts completely. "You've been weird all week," she said. "You look like you haven't slept." "What's going on, Sam?" He almost told her. God, he wanted to hand the whole impossible weight of it to someone else for just 5 minutes, the way you want to set down a bag that's cutting into your shoulder even knowing you'll have to pick it back up. But he thought of Thomas Henry Cotter's name, erased so cleanly even his own family's tree had smoothed shut around the gap, and he thought that whatever was going to happen at 4 o'clock when the fire chief handed him that rope in front of the whole cheering town, it was better if as few people as possible were standing close enough to be noticed doing anything but cheering. "Just tired," he said. "Bad week." She didn't believe him. But she let it go, the way you let things go with someone you trust even when the trust is being spent carelessly, and that, too, sat heavy in Sam's chest for the rest of the afternoon. At 3:45, Constance found him by the mill steps and pressed something small and cold into his hand, a fountain pen, old, the kind with a metal nib, filled, she told him, low and urgent, under the noise of the crowd, with ink she'd mixed herself that morning from a recipe in one of the Historical Society's oldest conservation manuals, iron gall ink, the same kind used in the original 1791 charter, the same kind that had, apparently, still been legible enough for a compact to hold. For 230 years. "If my theory's worth anything," she said, "the thing doesn't erase what's written. It erases what's held in a mind. The ledger still has 31 household spaces, near enough, if you look at the spacing close. The paper remembers even when we can't. So if you can write the name, the real name, all of it, out loud where the crowd can hear it and down on paper where the ink can hold it, in the same breath as it's fed, maybe, you give it something it can't quietly digest. A memory too public, too written down, too many places at once, to smooth back over before the wound even opens. That's a lot of maybes, Connie. "It's what we've got," she said, and her old hand, spotted and thin, closed hard over his for just a moment. Thomas Henry Cotter climbed up in that tower 50 years ago and used the only tool he had, which was a knife and some wood, to make sure somebody, someday, would know his name even after this thing tried to make sure nobody ever could. You have a whole radio station, Sam. You have a live microphone and 4 counties listening. Use the tool you've got. At 4 o'clock, under a sky gone the deep orange of a low autumn sun, the fire chief called Sam up onto the mill steps, and the crowd, friends, neighbors, people whose orders he knew by heart, people whose kids he'd watched grow up over 11 Octobers, turned toward him, warm and expectant and utterly unknowing, and somebody handed him the frayed end of the bell rope, and somebody else held a microphone up to his mouth for the live remote. And Sam Ellery, who had spent 11 years learning to make his voice sound like the safest thing in the world, felt his own pulse in his throat like a second, faster bell. ## Part 6. Folks, Sam said, and his voice went out over 91.3 FM into kitchens and cars and porches all through the valley, warm and steady. The voice Mrs. Abaird said was the best in 3 counties. "Before we ring this old bell one more time, I want to tell you a story. Won't take but a minute." The crowd, good-natured, settled in for what they assumed was color commentary. Somewhere near the front, Sam saw Priya go very still, watching him with the sharp attention of someone who had known him 3 years and could hear, under the practiced warmth, that something in this particular broadcast was not practiced at all. "This bell," Sam said, "was cast in 1791, the same year 31 families settled this town." 31. I want you to hold on to that number, because it's not the number written down in most of our records anymore, and I think that's worth wondering about, out loud, together, right now, while I've got you listening. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd, a few uncertain laughs, the kind people make when they're not sure if a joke has started yet. In 1974, Sam went on, steady, unhurried, the way he'd read 1,000 obituaries slow enough for a grieving family to catch every word. A 17-year-old boy from this town climbed up into this very bell tower and scratched a warning into the wood, because he understood something the rest of us had been made to forget. His name was Thomas Henry Cotter. He was somebody's son. He was somebody's brother. And 2 months after he wrote that warning, this town's own record stopped mentioning he had ever existed at all, not through anyone's evil, I don't think, not through anyone standing here today, but because of an old bargain none of us chose and none of us remember choosing, that trades a person, quietly, every so often, for the safety and the sweetness of this valley. The crowd had gone very quiet now, the uncertain laughter dying into a stillness that had teeth in it, and Sam felt the light around him take on the particular deepening quality of late October dusk, gold sliding fast toward gray, and somewhere behind his ribs he felt something vast and patient and hungry turn its attention toward the sound of his own voice, the way a held breath turns toward the moment it's finally about to be let go. "Thomas Henry Cotter," Sam said, louder now, and with his free hand he lifted Constance's fountain pen and pressed it, hard, to the folded paper in his palm, writing the name in iron gall ink even as he spoke it, was 17. He liked, according to the one newspaper notice that still exists about him, playing shortstop for the town league. He was a Cotter, one of this town's oldest names, and he deserves, his voice caught, just once, not from fear now but from something closer to grief, the grief of a man who had spent a week learning to mourn a boy 50 years gone whom nobody else alive even remembered enough to miss. He deserves to still be a name somebody says out loud. So I'm saying it. Thomas Henry Cotter. And I'd like everybody listening, everybody standing here on this green, to say it with me, right now, before I ring this bell. For one terrible, suspended second, nothing happened. The crowd stood in the gold-gray light, unsure, some smiling uncertainly, some already frowning with the first edge of real unease, waiting to see if this was, after all, only a strange piece of local color storytelling from their favorite radio voice. Then, from somewhere near the front, Constance's voice, cracked and clear and absolutely certain, rose up, "Thomas Henry Cotter." And Priya, close behind her, her young voice fierce with a loyalty she couldn't have explained, "Thomas Henry Cotter." And then it caught, the way fire catches in dry grass, moving through the crowd in ragged, overlapping waves, dozens of voices and then 100, people who had never heard the name before that afternoon saying it now because their neighbors were saying it, because there is something in a small town, when the trigger is pulled right, that will close ranks around a stranger's grief faster than around almost anything else. And Sam stood on the mill steps with the rope in one hand and the wet ink of a boy's whole name drying in his other, and felt the air around the tower go suddenly, sharply cold, colder than an October dusk had any right to be, the temperature dropping so fast that breath began to show white all across the green, and for just a moment, one moment, no longer, Sam thought he heard, underneath the crowd's rising voices, a second sound, high and thin and terribly young, almost like relief. Almost like a boy exhaling after 50 years of holding his breath in the dark. He pulled the rope. The bell rang. And this time, for the first time in 11 years, for the first time perhaps in longer than that, Sam Ellery heard it. Heard it clean and full and enormous, brass and iron shuttering the whole tower, rolling out low over the green and the river and the darkening mountains, and the sound did not feel like a summons anymore. It felt, for reasons he could not have explained to anyone who hadn't stood exactly where he was standing, like a door swinging open instead of shut. Like something finally, after 230 years, being allowed to leave instead of being made to stay. The town never spoke of it afterward, not directly. Cotter's Mill, Sam had come to understand, was a place built out of not speaking, in more ways than he'd ever guessed before that October. But something had shifted, all the same. Dot's Diner got a new stool put in at the end of the counter that November, unprompted, nobody quite able to say why the space had always looked wrong without one. The Historical Society's founding roll, when Constance checked it the following spring, still read 30 names, "Some scars," she said, "don't close, they only stop bleeding," but beside it now, in her own careful hand, she had added a note that would outlast her, outlast the ledger's binding, outlast, she hoped, whatever came hungry again in some future October, *a 31st household is known to have existed. Its youngest son was Thomas Henry Cotter, born 1957. He is remembered, *. And every year, on the last Saturday of October, when the fire chief hands Sam Ellery the frayed end of the bell rope in front of the whole warm, unknowing crowd, Sam says one name out loud before he pulls it, sometimes a name from the old records, sometimes, he suspects, a name he'll only learn the true weight of years later, the way you don't always recognize a debt until long after you've started paying it. He has never again failed to hear the bell. But some nights, alone in the radio booth with the red light glowing and the valley gone dark outside his window, he finds himself wondering, with a small persistent chill he has learned not to argue with, whether the naming is really a cure, or only, in its own quieter way, a new kind of bargain. Whether something out there in the cold hills beyond Cotter's Mill has simply learned that it can still be fed, so long as it's fed in the open, so long as somebody, once a year, is willing to stand up in front of a live microphone and hand over a name. He rings the bell anyway. It is, he has decided, still better than the alternative. He is just no longer entirely sure it is the truth. The end.